Happy New Year, everyone. We're now in the year 2024. However, for this video, my first video, I think, getting back to the channel, I want to actually look back at the last game that I played of 2023, Trinity Fusion. And while I don't believe it edged out as my game of the year per se, it's truly a special game that has many facets working in tandem to create a simply addictive loop. That being said, hello, my name is Falling Hurts. If you've never seen me before, I do reviews, previews, and interviews, all within games and, game development. And to just summarize a little bit, Trinity Fusion is a game where you take control of your parallel selves. And to kind of hit your need-to-knows, the version 1.0 of the original early access release of Trinity Fusion came out just last month, December 15th, 2023. And that was developed and self-published by Angry Mob Games, which I thank very much for the opportunity to review this game. I know I got to it way late, and I apologize for that. And as always for my reviews, let's break this down into the usual core 4 categories: the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and the sound designs. Starting with the story, I'll be straight up in saying that this is the weakest aspect of the game for me personally. Though in saying that, I want to clarify that the idea of multiple universes merging together and the narrative allowing you to control 3 alternate versions of yourself is a really cool idea. I won't spoil the story, but your main objectives are made fairly clear pretty much out of the gate, with some nice slide cutscenes in the beginning that feel actually really well presented. Unfortunately, my biggest letdown is that I think that the game rests on its laurels just a bit in that mid-game story presentation. When the meat of the mid-game is going on runs and trying to finish the mission that you've started, there's really only lore by the way of some of these offhanded audio logs that you can find, which I'll say right now, it's good. It adds good lore and depth to the universe, especially when you're doing one type of gameplay. I love that. Outside of that, you can talk to a few characters back at the main hub location, but again, it's just not the same as if I was doing something within these runs that made it felt like a story in and of itself. To me, this is when you should have stressed the importance of each timeline, and more importantly, it gives the player a chance to connect with each of these unique versions of the protagonist. Ultimately, there's a lot of good sci-fi presented with Trinity Fusion, and it's a great setting. I really do believe that. I just needed more to be invested in any way other than that gameplay loop. But speaking of the gameplay, that's my favorite part of this game, as you can probably clearly see. Bar none, some of the best fun that I've had all year. So to cover my bases, Trinity Fusion is a platformer roguelike with a really interesting gameplay twist. Or at least it's unique to me, as I don't usually play these type of games. Straight up. As I've said, you play as variants of the same character. And each of these girls bring their own weapon, spawn pools, locations to explore, and even abilities. The weapons themselves all feel fairly good, with the biggest choices of weapons being the variations between how much range the weapon has, as well as the speed of the attacks, and the random drops of weapons throughout the level do level with your character, so it all stays pretty well in line that whenever you're finding new weapons, for the most part, you're going to want to pick it up because it's the next best thing, but sometimes you may want to skip that for one reason or the other. Now, pair this with one of the many consumable attacks or defense abilities that you can pick up, such as a ability that shocks the whole screen and does a bunch of electric damage, or one where you just get a bubble shield that will absorb the next 2 hits that you take, and really you've got a good bit of control over what customization you can do as far as your loadout. But it really comes down to when you find these items, if that makes sense. Now, your freedom doesn't end there. As you play, you'll find these stations where you'll be able to choose one of 3 amplifiers for your character. Some modifiers are less noticeable, like that you take 30% less damage when you're above 70% health. Though there are others that change the game drastically, like one that slows projectiles when they're near you within 5 meters, making it really important during especially those bullet hell boss fights. And another one that I thought was really interesting but I didn't like as much was that when you get hit, you lose your coins, which are your run-based currency, instead of health. So it's like you made it really far but you're really broke, so it's like the DJ Khaled suffering from success, you know what I mean? But these attributes are thrown into different categories, such as evasion or damage. As you can see, they're indicated by what color they add to. And as you'll also notice in the screenshots or whatever video I put over this, that each of those little emblems at the top has 3 sections that fill out as you choose these different things. So as you're picking these different amplifiers, they compound to even greater gains when all 3 of those are filled up, when you pick 3 of a certain type, and then you get these nice little perks like faster cooldowns for your abilities or even better attack speeds, which both are very important and very helpful, and they're not special abilities that you have to use, it's just something that passively increases and just makes you stronger. I really love how all of these systems kind of conform together to make a really, really good gameplay loop. Especially when in combat, all of these perks and modifiers really make the difference, and choosing the best combination can be a fun challenge. And as you progress further and get further into these runs, defeating the first couple bosses, you'll realize that you can actually start to mesh 2 of the universes together. Meaning when I'm playing as one of the characters, I'll actually be able to kind of merge my timeline with one of the other ones, and you'll get access to some of their special weapons and loot pools, as well as their individual abilities. For instance, one of the girls actually cannot do a double jump, but once you merge with the others in the final bits of your run, you'll actually still have access to the double jump, just like the rest of them. As well as other abilities that they have. One character has a drone that can kind of be used in certain situations as like a Metroidvania element. And overall, I like the system a lot. It definitely is then that you start to feel really powerful. It's something you can do pretty early on in your runs if you want to, but eventually if you want to continue your run after a certain point, that is pretty much something you're going to have to do, I think. Regardless though, I've talked a lot about how you're going to fight and how combat works on a character-specific level, but not really so much what you're fighting. Enemies in the game truly come in 3 main distinctions. You've got the base enemies that populate the levels as you go, elite enemies, which are basically just stronger and more aggressive versions of these same enemies on the levels, and then finally you've got the boss fights, which kind of cap off these certain sections and really feel like milestones within your runs. Now, starting with the base enemies within the levels, there's actually a pretty wide range, both visually and thematically speaking. There's a bunch, and while I'll talk more about the visuals in a little bit, it's important to note that that translates to the gameplay as well. For instance, some of the plant and creature enemies may poison you, while robots could make you weak or electrocuted. There is a wide variety of enemies, and they work fairly differently for the most part. There are those that simply lunge at you for melee damage, some that shoot projectiles, or create an area of effect damage, and some even do a combination of all of these. Enemies range in all shapes, sizes, speeds, and the difference between ground and air. The game handles this beautifully within the sandbox, and my only true issue I ever had was that there's this wasp type enemy, which was really easy to get them stuck in the walls, meaning that you couldn't kill them, at least in my instance a lot of the times. But thankfully, since I'm reviewing this a little bit later, I can tell you that that was in the patch notes to be fixed. Now, as for boss enemies, I really loved the gameplay designs here. From electric grids, devastating lasers, and wide noxious clouds, there's all kinds of different ways that the game forces you to platform and use the perfect dodge mechanic in these sections. It's really well done, and the game feels really smartly designed in that way. I will say that there was one boss that seemed way more difficult than where it was in the game, like in the run itself. But overall, I felt like I was, just spending a try or 2 on each boss, or sometimes even less if I was really OP at the end of a run. So I felt challenged, but at the end of the day, I think I only did like 16, maybe 17 runs for the whole game, which I don't think is that bad, especially considering the first couple runs I was just kind of getting my grips on the gameplay mechanics. There's a lot of depth here, and I must stress this because between different difficulties, endless and boss rush modes, there's a lot of stuff to do outside of that main experience. And I dropped over 13 hours into just the base game alone without even thinking about it, and I mean that in the best way possible, because to me that's just great pacing, when the time and the hours just fly by. Now, moving on to visuals, I have a full confession to make. I played 100% of this playthrough on the Steam Deck. Now, on the Steam Deck, the preset settings are fairly low, but the game's visuals and styles didn't feel compromised at all. I will say there were still 1 or 2 performance dips where in the detailed 3D environments that were really deep, and there was still a lot of combat going on in the foreground. But otherwise, the game runs really smooth. You can even tweak a few settings here and there to make it look a little better. But overall, I didn't feel that was necessary. Now, I've recorded all the footage for this video on PC at max settings, and I believe the visuals speak for themselves otherwise, because it does look really good, and even playing it, it makes me really excited to probably play through the game again on a harder difficulty. But I want to specifically call out the particle effects on attacks and the elemental effects, as well as the myriad of expansive backgrounds that you can come across. The city wall level is such a cool perspective, as well as some of inside the factories, just the dynamic look of the backgrounds as you're moving across them just feels so, I don't know, futuresque. It's just awesome. It definitely adds a lot to the tone of the game as well. And it's stuff like this that truly makes me hope that they do another game refining even further on this formula. And I said I would, so I will. So let's talk the visuals of the enemies for just a second. As I've already said, there's a big range in how each of them function. But while I could just sit here and say that the enemies look good, blah, 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 you know, I mean, the way they attack is this or that, it's really flashy, really pretty. But I really did want to take a chance to talk a little bit and appreciate the animations. Each enemy has one or many more attacks. They must telegraph this to the player, and I'd say that the game does this quite well. The only time I think that it's a little less than stellar is when you're right next to one of those little lunging balls, and they still do full damage to you even though they've basically just jumped at you at point blank with no momentum. The bosses and some of the larger sub-boss styled enemies are way more intricate, which makes them really special and really fun to come across. These are the enemies that have multiple attacks that you need to decipher how to react as quickly as possible, so it's super important that the animations convey this well. At any given time, you're only holding one or more healing items, so it's imperative to make the most of your time in your runs. Visually speaking, and I know this is going to sound like a cop-out a bit, my only super duper dramatic nitpick is that the loading screen, where it's just the three girls, really just looks bad. I don't know why. I love all of the other art in the game, so it's not like I'm picking on an artist or something just so I can have something negative to say. But man, I don't know, it just looks too sterile, and something about it just feels a little off to me. I don't know what it is. But that's really not a criticism of the game at all. That's just me saying something. So tell me to shut up if you want. But with that bullshit out of the way, let's move on to the sound of the game. First off, the soundtrack. I really like how varied it can be from location to location. And I also like that based on where you're at, you may get more of a techno to almost more of a melancholic blend. And while earlier I said that ultimately between these three characters you play as, there isn't much to pick up from a story difference, there is definitely music to help you differentiate each of them thematically, which is huge as far as the game goes tonally when you're playing as these three different people. Of course, music, while tonally very important, it's not actually as important to the gameplay as, say, the sound effects are. For instance, the slice or the pound of a melee weapon, or the varied sounds of the different guns that you can use within the game, all sound very, very powerful, and that really adds to making you feel powerful as well. So if anything, that feeds really well into the satisfaction loop. There are a few enemy tells as well that, based on the sounds that the enemies make, you may be able to tell what attack they're going to do, or at least that's how I kind of picked up on things. Maybe I was just getting lucky, but it seemed like the enemy as well as the character sound effects were really well done as well. Now, comparatively, I know that's short to the other aspects of this review, but I didn't want to waste your time on anything that, I'll be honest, I say I don't know that much about. I can only tell you how the sound design really makes me feel. I'm not going to tell you what cores or instruments are used, because I couldn't fucking tell you, man. But with that being said, I want to say that wholeheartedly I recommend this game at full price, which is $20 US, which I think is totally fair for both the hours you play, as well as if you really enjoy the loop, how much extra time you're going to get out of that as well. Trinity Fusion is one of those games where I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. Even outside looking in, I wasn't as drawn to the art style, but through strong visual quality throughout, with mountains upon mountains upon mountains of player choice, and a satisfying gameplay loop that always feeds back into those decisions that you're making throughout your runs, it's clear that the roguelike formula was really well handled here, and as much as I love this game, I can't wait to see what the developers do next. But thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Falling Hurts, and if you like it, consider subscribing. And if you want to look for more videos like this going forward, you're going to find them right here, and we're going to try to stick to a semi-regular upload cadence for as long as I can. You know, it's a crazy time. I'm a young dad. You know how things go. And that's really about it, man. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.